In my previous video, Why Does Intelligence Manifest?, I had a subsection talking about continuity of identity, but in this video I'd really like to elaborate on that because it's an important part of the overall puzzle, which is my model. So this is continuity of identity, how to make sense of our experience. I'm going to attempt to make two major points. The first major point is that objects are conceptual. And the second point is that signals, specifically referring to brain signals here, are intermittent or digital rather than analog, essentially. So getting into the first point, objects are conceptual. Every object is made up of something else, in other words, other objects. Objects are conceptual perceptions of networked points. So if you think about the idea of, a person, if you zoom in, right, if we take a small part of the person and we zoom in, then inside of that there's like skin cells and things like that. And then if you zoom in on the skin cells, you can start to see smaller and smaller objects. You get down to atoms, and atoms are made up of particles, and the particles are made up of, you get the point. It goes on and on and on. The idea here is that when choosing which object exists, technically all of them exist and none of them exist. It depends on what is interacting and which observer is observing at which scale. So we'll get into that in a moment. So, in one sense, an atom contains 99% empty space. In another sense, there is no edge separating the atom from everything else in the universe. It's all one giant object. And so this gets a bit into field theory and things like that, which I'm not going to go too deep into most likely. But the essential idea is that, so if you think of I guess this would be somewhat of an old concept of the atom, where it's almost like planets, right, in an orbit. So this would be like the electron, the proton, the neutron, etc. So if you think about this, there's this great space between the parts of the atom, right? And so in that sense, there's 99% empty space in the atom. But in another sense, there's no such thing as empty space because all space is filled with fields, and those fields are either being disturbed or not disturbed, which we'll touch on a little bit later. But the point is that, like, if you think of it in terms of like planets, right? The Earth and the Moon are always connected by things like gravity, right? So there's always something between them. And even if you talk about empty space, like if you're floating out in space, there are elements in that space. There are fields in that space. No matter how thinly they are stretched, there's no such thing as pure emptiness. Emptiness would be non-existent, right? It wouldn't be viewed as space. It would be the absence of even space. So I know that's difficult to conceptualize, but the point that I'm trying to make here is essentially that what separates something from another thing is essentially illusory, or it's relative would be a better way to think about it than illusory. And so when you think of, the two pool balls colliding, that's a little bit too close together, the two pool balls colliding, it's not really that one ball and another ball exist and that the atoms don't exist. It's that the atoms exist and the ball exists, which is relatively confusing when you think about, well, how can, like if we were to take a bunch of pool balls and put them together, you wouldn't say that's an object, right? But at the same time, if you get hit in the face by, let's say, a bag of pool balls, you would call it a bag of pool balls, right? You would think of it kind of conceptually as an object. So essentially what I'm trying to explain is that depending on what scale you're looking at and how you're interacting with it, an object either does or does not exist. Hence, objects are conceptual, not really how we normally think about them. So fields interact, not objects. So if you think about, for example, we'll go back to the pool balls. So the two pool balls, when they touch, it isn't really the pool ball that touches the other pool ball. It's not like the atoms are like these little miniature pool balls that are hitting into each other so much. It's more so that the fields, because the particles themselves are fields, they are a disturbance in a field of energy, the fields kind of press on each other. And another way to think about that is kind of like magnets, right? If you have two magnets, they sort of have these magnetic fields that can attract or repel. So similar to the gravity with the planets that are kind of attracting each other, it's I guess attraction wouldn't be correct in gravity, but that's not the point. The point is that the force or the relationship is a better word between them is what's really interacting. It's not the objects, and even the object themselves are made up of those smaller conceptual objects, which are themselves only together. Like if you think of the bag of the pool balls, they're only together in this shape because of their relationship with each other and each other's fields. So none of them are really touching, and in truth, none of them even really exist. There aren't any particles, there aren't any magnets, they're all just different. Like if you think of it almost like a grid, right? Like a point grid, something like this. You could almost think of it as like different quantities or values on a point grid. So this could be +3, this could be -3, +4, whatever you want to call it. And so what looks like an object, like this might look like an object if you are interacting with this field in a certain way, or this point network in a certain way, right? Because if you are, let's say, -3 over here, and you get close enough to this field, well, -3 and +3 might combine, and they might equal themselves out to 0, right? And so that interaction isn't so much an object interacting with another object, it's really a field interacting with another field. But we'll get more into that in a bit. So, certain objects only exist on certain scales, like images made of pixels or constellations. So, to use the constellation concept first, so there are, stars, right? Just like these points I was talking about earlier, there are these stars. I guess this is supposed to be the Dipper, I don't know. And because we perceive them conceptually as connected, we can look at them and say, oh, that's an object, right? But really, there's nothing objectively saying that these stars are one object. And even if they are, because you say, well, the stars, their light reaches each other, and so they're within a certain distance, or like maybe if they're close enough gravity, or whatever the case may be, the point is that there's no difference between the relationship between one star and another star that are close together and that star and a star a million miles away. The only difference is the value, right? So if we think of something like gravity or distance, distance is also a value, right? So just because this distance might be 100 and this distance might be, let's say, 2 or something like that, or 5, whatever, the idea is that just because these two are close together doesn't make them more of an object than these two. So when we are understanding objects to scale, we have to understand that if you take, say, for example, a cluster like this, right? If you take a cluster like this, from this distance, from this scale, right now this looks like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 different objects, right? But if you were to zoom in on one of these objects, that object looks like a cluster of other objects. So where's the one object in this image, right? And similarly, where's the one object in this image? These all look like 7 separate objects. And if you zoom out, right, if you zoom out here, then this group, this cluster, can look like one object. So it all has to do with scale. And if we think of like an image of pixels, right? Pixels are kind of like squares. Usually they're squares, I think. And the idea is that you can make an image of a bunch of pixels. This is probably not going to work as well as I want it to, but that's okay. We'll do our best. You can make a image, like let's say, for example, we draw a square, right? So if we draw a square by filling in these pixels, then it can look like one object, like these 4 are one square. But when you understand them on a pixel level, it's actually 4 smaller squares. But when you zoom out enough, those 4 pixels kind of blend together and it looks like one bigger square. So again, all of this has to do with scales and fields, and the object only exists in what we think of as the eye of the beholder, right? The object itself never truly exists. It's just a relationship between different values, and those values can scale up or down, right? You can divide. If I have a circle and I divide it in half, well, now I have 2, right? But then if I take this circle and I divide that in half, now I have 2 inside of the 2. And if I take this and I divide this in half, you get the point. The point is that within this square are an infinite number of squares if I just keep dividing the squares. So the idea is that there's no object on one level. It's that it's a field of infinite points, and you can decide, or not necessarily decide, but depending on what layer of that infinite field of points you are perceiving, you may perceive an object, but that object is conceptual, not real. I mean, it's real in the sense that you're experiencing it, but it's an experience in the same way that I always use the dream analogy or a simulation analogy. If you're inside of a computer simulation, just like real life, there are all these points right inside the computer simulation, and all of them are being valued in a certain way according to the program and how it's written, right? So if you walk up to a certain point, you might run into a wall in the game. Like if your character is trying to run, if your character's trying to run and there's this barrier here, when they run into the barrier, they're running into a wall, right? Like if this is a castle, then you would say, oh, my character's running into the castle wall. But is there really a castle and is there really a body? Like, no, these are all, if you were to look at it from the simulation perspective, if you looked at it as a code, this is all just code. These are all just numbers, right? They're all just whatever. So the point is that just because you can experience the interaction between what appear to be two objects doesn't mean that those objects are real in the way that you normally think of them as being real. They're conceptual. Same thing as a dream. I can pick up a ball and throw it in my dream, but did I really pick up a ball? Did I really throw it? Did it really move? Is there space between me and the ball now? How could there be space between my mind and my mind, right? If the ball is in my mind. And how could there be space between one object and another object within a program? Where is that space? What does that even mean for there to be space in a program? The space is really represented by numbers, right? So we'll move on to the next point. I think I've clarified that enough. Okay, so the brain is like an orchestra. So we're getting into the next major point now. Signals are inconsistent, or this is supposed to be intermittent. So the idea here is that if we think of the brain as like electrical signals, which it's more than just that, but that's kind of the basic idea, right? If we think of the brain as electrical signals, it's easy to think of the brain as just one object that's generating this one electrical signal, right? But that's not really the case. Each individual neuron, the microtubules, whatever you want to talk about, the idea is that, the electrons interacting with each other, everything happens on a scale. And so just like we were just talking about, as you zoom in, there are objects within objects within objects. So you have to understand it more in a sort of digital sense than an analog sense. If you think of the brain as just this thing that's producing one continuous signal, that's not really true. If you were to divide it up and say, for example, like different regions of the brain, like one region of the brain might be more active than another region of the brain at any given time, right? So the entire brain is not active at all times. And if you were to zoom in again on one region of the brain, what you'd be looking at is like, God, how do I draw a neuron? What you'd be looking at is like these neurons. This is probably not a good drawing, but that's okay. Individual neurons that make up this region, right? And then if you looked at the neurons, there's things making that up, and so on and so forth, like sodium-potassium pumps and things like that allow these electrical signals to even be generated. So the idea is that there isn't just this one continuous brain. The brain isn't just one object producing one signal. It's a bunch of little objects producing individual interactions over time, kind of like notes in a music. Individual neurons are not firing continuously. So there are breaks between the signals being produced by the neurons. And this is really important for the point that we'll get into next. So music, like physical objects, only exists in perception as a concept, not a real thing. So if you think of like the notes, right? The notes on, I forgot what that's called, a staff, I think is what it's called. If you think of the notes, right? Individual notes are separate. Okay, but when we put them together and we play them through instruments, they create what we think of as a concept or an object called music, like a song. A song is considered an object to us, more on the conceptual level than, say, for example, a box or a table, but still, nevertheless, fits within my model of object being concepts. So we experience a song as a thing, just like we experience a table as being a thing, but it's not really a thing. It's made up of individual things. And those individual things are made up of smaller things, like the different values within a wave. And the wave is very similar to a field, right? So we're going kind of full circle. So the idea is that when you're thinking of music, you have to think of the music, and we're comparing the orchestra of the brain, right? The signals that are moving around inside your brain to create this sort of orchestra of the brain, I guess. The song, or I should say song of your brain, is made up of individual notes, individual instruments, which are regions of the brain or individual neurons, so on and so forth. So in the same way that we wouldn't say that a song is a single object, even though we kind of experience it as one when we're putting it in our playlist, so like we put one song in our playlist, right? So we think of it as one object. It's not really. And in that same way, the brain signal that is intermittent within our brain is not one single object or signal. So the notes of the music are separated by silence. The brain is digital, not analog. No matter which part of the brain you think the mind resides in, at some point it is silent. So comparing the silence of the brain to the empty space, and again, empty space is again a concept. Everything, it's really important to understand that these things are concepts, and that just like zero can represent the absence of something, but zero can still be done as math, right? And it can be like a placeholder and things like that. So the point is that even though zero kind of conceptually represents nothingness, that concept of nothingness can still interact with other concepts as long as it's all existing within a mind, right? Where that information can be contained and interact with each other. So the point is that when you think of silence or emptiness, so if we're thinking of a physical object contains little objects with space between them, this empty space between them, so objects contain empty space. In the same way, okay, the music or the electrical signals in our brain contain little notes, right, that can be separated into individual values. And each individual like neuron or region of the brain is like a separate instrument that's playing their own separate notes, okay, that are separated in the same way that empty space separates the objects. The individual notes are separated by silence, okay? So we're kind of considering empty space the same thing as silence, all right? And this is really important. So it's important because silence is the same as death, just like empty space is the same as death, just on a smaller scale. Death is observing silence or zero activity or emptiness. So if we think of a field, which we'll get more into this later, if we think of a field like a pond, right? If we think of the surface of a pond, if there's zero activity, then the value of every point on the surface of this pond in terms of activity is zero, okay? But if we drop our pebble into the pond, then it creates this ripple, right, outwards. And now we have these values that can differentiate the surface activity from each other, which creates essentially the notes, right? Or the individual points, whether they're high or low, can be considered objects like electrons and protons and, like similar to charge and things like that. So the point that I'm trying to make is that depending on the scale, it's all essentially just different variations of activity. And when there is zero activity to experience or perceive, that is essentially death. When you are observing zero activity, like think of like listening to silence. What are you listening to? You're listening to nothing. Now, I mean, on a very technical level, like there's like electromagnetic static and things like that your ears aren't picking up. But that's not the point. The point that I'm trying to make is that when you are listening to zero sound, you're listening to silence. And when there's zero sound, you can't differentiate any one point of silence from another point of silence. So it's all one object, right? And when it's all one object, there's no you in the object. There's no smaller object to differentiate it. So in other words, if you're looking at absolute nothingness or absolute silence, if you're experiencing zero activity, then you are experiencing the same thing that you will experience at death, which is an undifferentiated experience, an undifferentiated or undisturbed continuity or wave or whatever you want to call it. So, and essentially, this is comparing, if we go back to the analogies, it's like a dreamless sleep, right? Which technically a dreamless sleep, your brain is having some activity, but that's not the point. We're using it as an analogy. In the analogy, a dreamless sleep is the same thing as experiencing nothing. For whatever period of time you're sleeping, you're experiencing nothing. So when you wake up, between the time you go to sleep and when you wake up, you had no experience. Effectively, you had no experience. Subjectively, you had no experience. And so that's the same thing as death, the lack of experience. What is death other than, how would you describe it other than, I'm no longer having an experience? So it's really important to understand that death and emptiness and silence are conceptually the same thing in terms of they're all basically zero activity to be perceived, right? And so when we're experiencing zero activity, that is that experience of emptiness or death or silence. So the silence between brain activities, like little individual notes being played by the brain orchestra, that is the same thing as experiencing very small deaths, right? Like if we think of this as, if we think of each line as like an experience or a frame of experience where there is something to experience, right? So this is an experience, and then this is experience, and then this is experience, etc. The space between them is essentially death. But because we don't experience emptiness, because it is the absence of experience, just like when you experience going to sleep and then you experience waking up, but you had a dreamless sleep where you had no experience in between, it's like you go to sleep and wake up at the same time, right? Kind of like that concept of the great cycle where death and birth are essentially the same point, right? Because you can't experience nothingness. You can't experience nothingness as an experience. It is the absence of experience. So no matter how much nothingness there is between point A and B, no matter how many zeros there are, so to speak, between point A and B, it eventually gets condensed where A and B are a single point, okay? So quantum field theory, disturbance, the fundamental equation, and the presence of an undisturbed mental field that contains and generates all of the fields. So all these fields that we talk about in quantum field theory, which you don't have to understand quantum field theory. I certainly don't fully understand it. I'm not a physicist, but you don't even have to understand it really in depth conceptually as an abstract concept, which is the level that I understand it on. Just kind of think of it as like kind of like objects, right? Where there's an overlap, and when there's an overlap, there's an interaction, right? So if you think of two fields interacting with each other, there has to be a point in which those fields interact or overlap in some way in order for the activity of one field to interact with the activity of another field, right, in this sort of Venn diagram. And so if you think about how a field works, we kind of already discussed this with the pond analogy. A field works very similar to a body of water where the field exists even if there's zero activity in the field. Right? So this is why we say, for example, that there's no such thing as empty space. There's no such thing as a true vacuum, because even the vacuum is filled with a field that is perhaps undisturbed at that time. So even at the beginning of the universe, when people would say like, well, okay, there's nothing at the beginning of the universe if you go far enough back, there were these undisturbed fields, right? But in order for the fields to interact with each other, they have to have a common medium of some sort. And so what I'm essentially saying to you is that what allows one field to disturb another field is the universal field. The universal field is the mind, okay? So if we go back to my original theory about how outside of the mind there's nothing and inside of the mind there's essentially concepts of the mind, which if there's nothing at the time that is interacting with the mind, there's no information coming into the mind that the mind can then conceptualize, then all it has is the concept of nothing, okay? And this concept of nothing is a type of disturbance in the field, right? Which can become a conceptual object, which can interact with other nothings and so on and so forth. We have already gone over this. So the whole point is that in order for these other fields to exist, all within one field, the only way for them to exist is if there's something to perceive that field and interact with it. And so the one field that can interact with all fields and also contains all other fields is the mind. It's the only thing, the perceiver or the observer, if you think of the observer as a field, which maybe at some point science will get to that point, I hope so. If they think of the observer as a field, then the observation of other fields is what allows those fields to be disturbed by the absence of other things, by the absence of other disturbances, right? It's a conceptual disturbance within a conceptual field. So we're getting a bit abstract. Let's move on to the next point. If brain activity and physical form are separated by space and silence, which again we're equating to essentially miniature deaths, right? Just like the silence between music is not itself technically music, it's not technically sound, right? It's separating the notes. So space and silence are separating experience within our brain or within our form. why do we perceive ourselves as a person or an object having one continuous experience, even after coming back from death? And I mean this both in the sense of like operations where people's body temperature are lowered to the point where they're dead and there's zero brain activity for long periods of time, like up to an hour, and they come back. We talked about this in the previous video. Why does intelligence manifest? Or actual death, like when someone dies and then they're resuscitated, or the miniature deaths, like what I'm saying is the space between forms or the silence between brain activity, right? So if you think of a brain, if we think of a brain as when it's active, it's alive, right? So when it's active, it's alive. But when the brain stops being active and flatlines, we think of this as death. So this is a living brain, alive, and this is a dead brain, right? This is essentially the current scientific definition or medical definition of death, is zero brain activity. So if this is a living brain and this is a dead brain, if we zoom in to the living brain, there are points, just like I was talking about, the silence between the notes being played, there are points, miniature points of zero activity. So what we're essentially saying, or what I'm saying, is that there are those miniature deaths. The brain is always both alive and dead in different regions of the brain, all right? So regardless of which part of the brain you think consciousness is contained within, that part of the brain at some point has zero activity, even during your normal living state. All right. So because the brain is technically, you could call it miniature flat lines, there's so many miniature flat lines within every moment, right? Within the brain. You just have to zoom into the proper scale to see that. So if we are essentially saying that this person is dead and this person is alive, then when we zoom in, we should say that this person, the living person, is also experiencing death, then life, then death, then life, then death, then life, then death, then life, right? It's a cycle, a constant cycle of going in and out of death and life based on what we are and are not experiencing. Because we're not experiencing a lack of activity in the brain, right? So that is death. That is the dreamless sleep, essentially. So we only experience the blips where there is activity. But because it's a on and off, like I said, it's kind of like digital, because it's on and off and on and off, whenever the brain is off, even if it's a small region, that region is experiencing death. And because at some point the brain is essentially off, that brain is experiencing a micro death, right? So why, if there is this like miniature death, why do we perceive ourselves as a person having one continuous experience? So if we think of coming back from death, what separates the living us from the other living us? So if we think of one moment of activity in the brain, and then there's a flat line, and then there's another moment of activity in the brain. Again, this is kind of, the way I'm drawing this is not technically correct, but hopefully by now you get the point. There are little moments of silence in the brain, especially in different individual regions, especially on the micro scale. So if this is life, then death, then life again, like this, then what connects this to this? What connects A to B, right? So if there's this frame in between where we're dead, basically, we're effectively dead on a very, very small scale, then why should A and B be the same person if there's this space between them, right? Normally when we think of space between two objects, it makes them separate objects. If we think of space between two notes in music, they're separate notes because there's space or silence between them, right? So if there's space or silence between two instances of life, then why are we having one continuous experience? That's not a logical conclusion. So if you make an exact copy of yourself and the copies are standing in the same room, they can't be having the same experience. They aren't both you, right? So if I have you, and we'll say this is you, and I make an exact copy of you, so every single part of you is identical. Every neuron in the brain, every memory that you have, every skin cell, right? It's all an exact copy. I know this is probably physically impossible, but for the sake of this, think of it like a copy of a file on a hard drive, right? It's an exact copy of all the exact same data. That's the point that I'm trying to make here, so bear with me. So if we make an exact copy of you in a room, in space, if there's space between the copies of you, right, you would agree with me, I think all of you would say that this is not the same you. It's a copy of you, but if you were this one and then made a copy of you and sent it to the other corner of the room, you would say this is you and this is not you, right? So, from moment to moment, we are chronological copies of ourselves. There is nothing about the brain or objects or signals or anything that implies we should be existing as one continuous experience or being. This is one reason why the hard problem of consciousness is so difficult to explain away. The hard problem of consciousness, if you're not familiar with it, basically asks the question, why do these little like neurons and electrical signals, why does all of this produce a conscious experience? It doesn't actually make sense. And to date, this is an unanswered problem within neurology, philosophy, religion, science, whatever you want to call it. This is still unanswered. There's no conclusive answer. And I'm attempting to help you answer it with my model. So the idea is that this is, what we're talking about here is not just a simple like, oh yeah, but science can explain this away. We just need someone smarter here to respond to this. No, this is not so easy to explain. This has not been explained to date, and maybe it will be in the future, but I don't think it will be explained with the current model that science, mainstream science proposes. I think that we'll need to adjust that model to a great degree to something closer to what I'm proposing. This sort of like mind or the observer is itself a self-observing field, right, that will allow us to get closer to the truth. So from moment to moment, we are chronological copies of ourselves. So in the previous slide, we talked about A and B being separated by space. Makes it so obvious, right? If this is you and this is a copy of you, then they're not the same, right? A copy is not the same as the original. But this is space. If we now separate it by time, what's the difference? If this was you at one point and this is you now, how does this have one continuous identity? Why, if this is separated by silence or emptiness or space or time, how are those two things the exact same? They have a relationship with each other, just like there's a relationship between you and your copy, right? You have the same data, you exist in the same space, the same room, whatever the case may be. You might have the same name. There's relationships, but there's nothing that guarantees or explains or says that just because you exist on the same timeline together, that you must be the same experience or object, right? Like right now, you are not experiencing what it was like to be you when you were a baby, right? So your baby self and you now are not the same. You aren't currently having the experience of you as a baby. You have some of the same memories, some of the same cells, right? So essentially what I'm trying to explain is that because of this time, the sort of like life, death, life, death, life, death, because there is space separating the experiences, right? So we can think of this as A, B, C, D, E, F. There's space between and time between, emptiness, silence, whatever you want to call it, between instances or frames of our existence as an object, as an identity, as a person. And what I'm trying to explain to you is that there's nothing that says that these things should connect as a single continuous identity or experience. So you should only exist as you in one particular moment. So if this is frame A, right, of you, and then frame B is, let's say, 1 second later, frame B 1 second later should essentially be the same as a copy of you. And on top of that, it's not even a perfect copy because over time, your atoms are decaying, the neurons are rewiring themselves, your skin cells are dying, right? You're aging, so on and so forth. You have different data in your brain because you're having new experiences, you have new memories that are forming, etc. So this isn't even a perfect copy of you. So why is this the same person? So, to compare this, let's use the Star Trek transporter, right? So if we have a transporter and transporter A, so this is you standing on this transporter, okay? And we take apart all of your molecules, and then those molecules are put back together on this transporter, on transporter B. The idea is supposed to be that this is you being transported across distance by taking you apart and putting you back together. But think about it this way. People think like, oh yeah, that's me, right? Because it's the same timeline. It's me here and then I'm here. Okay. But when we add space to this and I make another copy of you, so let's say that we create transporter C where we put together at the same exact time a separate copy of you, right? I guess this doesn't look exactly the same. So we put together a separate copy of you at the exact same time. Which of these copies is you? Are you B or are you C? And how would you even know if you were the same as A? Because of course, if they're exact copies of you, each one of these is going to think that they are the original because they have the same brain, the same brain network, the same information contained inside of it as A. But what if we were to recreate A on pad A? Well, now there's 3, right? So again, which one are you? So you can see the problem here that arises with this assumption, this sort of intuitive assumption that just because you're you, air quotes, that you must have one continuous experience. But there's nothing on the objective level between the objects. There's nothing saying that those objects are the same, right, over space and time. Technically speaking, they're not. Your brain's changing, your body's changing, it's not the same object. And there's nothing in terms of the time between you or the space between you that says that you're the same object. You're not at the same point in space and time, right? So it becomes more clear when we add a second copy of you. So if you say like, okay, I'm here and I'm walking, right? And I walk across space and time to here, okay? But if we were able to create a second copy of you who's also over here, you would then be like, well, wait, if a one copy of me walked here and one copy of me walked here, now I don't know which one I am. And this is very similar to how fields work, right? The sort of uncollapsed wave function in quantum physics, it's sort of similar to, like if we think of rolling a die, right? If you roll a die and on the die there is I don't know if this is how the numbers would show up, but there's 1 through 6, right, on the die. Well, while it's rolling, technically speaking, there's not a single number facing upward, right? We don't know. It's sort of like if you were to cover it in a fog, right? That's sort of like what a quantum state is, or a wave function before its collapse. It's sort of like a fog where you don't know exactly where the highest point of value is in that field. So remember the field being something that can be disturbed or undisturbed. So you don't know where the actual number is in that, the number being the point with the highest disturbance, which would be the highest probability that actually came true. Sorry, this is getting a little bit too abstract and complicated, but the point that I'm trying to make is that until it shows up, it's technically, potentially, all the numbers at once and none of the numbers at once, right? So it's all 1 through 6, and it's also none of 1 through 6 because it's not an individual number yet. So the point is that as we are going through time and space, we could be any variation of ourself. And if you were to show, which we can't right now with the technology we have, but if it were possible to, like the transporter, transport yourself to 2 different locations at the same time, you would suddenly realize, wait, by transporting myself to 2 different locations at the same time, what I've really done is transported the data, the information. So who are you? You are the information or the identity. We've been talking about this concept of the cup, right? And how if you put information or experience into a form, that form helps shape it, right? But there's nothing about the form that actually says that you are having that experience. So if you were on pad A and then I transported 2 separate copies to pad B and C, there's absolutely nothing mathematically or scientifically that says that you, just because the information is the same, that you would experience this one or this one. And we can make an infinite number of copies, right? So the point being that just because the information is moving across time and the information is a sequence doesn't mean that you should be experiencing the same perspective across space and time. So again, I know this is still complex and complicated, but bear with me. So let me take a sip of water real quick. We've said a lot. Okay, so now what happens if you create 2 copies on the other end of the transporter at the same time? Which one are you? So we basically just explained that. So what's the conclusion here? All of this only begins to make sense when it's occurring within a greater medium or mind, a mental field in which all of these disturbances are rising and falling and being perceived. like a dreamer or a simulation. So we'll come back to this in a minute. The brain isn't producing the mind is perceiving the brain as an object within its field, both as an object and a continuous experience. It's easier to make the parts within the mind or the whole than it is to make the whole or the mind from the parts. So for the same reason, a constellation and music aren't real unless they're being perceived by something that is capable of perceiving them in that way. So, excuse me, let's break this down real quick. So first, let's take the dreamer or the simulation, right? So all of the disturbances, all of the objects in your mind are occurring within the same mind. So if we think of this is the bigger bubble of your mind, right? And you're asleep over here, and your mind is what's creating this dream world. So everything inside this bubble is a part of your mind. All right. So if we think of this as a field of your mind, kind of like that pond, right? If we think of this similar to a pond that can be undisturbed or disturbed, right? An undisturbed dream would be like a dreamless sleep. A disturbed field would be like a dream where you have like characters and objects and things like that, right? So if we think of the character in the dream as you, the reason you can experience this character as you is not because the character is generating you or the dream, it's because the dream is generating the character, okay? Now, if you think about the way a dream works, if you were to go into a dream and say, the reason that I am this person is because somewhere inside their head is a brain, and the brain is generating these electrical signals. And those electrical signals, despite the fact that all the signals are completely separate, like different instruments in the orchestra, and there's space between all the particles that make up the brain, all this, despite the fact that there's nothing inherently connecting all these into one object except for perception, which, by the way, the perception is taking place by the dreamer, despite that, this is creating the dream and creating my experience. It just doesn't rationally make sense, right? And so if you apply this to similarly, if you apply it to a simulation, right? So the only difference between a simulation and a dream is like, let's say instead of a dreamer, we have a server, right? So this server is creating this simulation based on code, right? So this server is creating this simulation based on code, and there's a character. So let's say it's simulating a video game. There's a character inside the video game, and this character, that's the character you're playing when you're playing the video game. And so you, the mind, are having this experience of, oh, I'm this character, I'm in this game, I'm, doing battle or exploring the city or whatever the case may be. You're having this experience, and if you think of it as, well, the reason I'm able to have this experience is because I'm this body, and this body is generating this experience, it doesn't make sense, right? If you were to look inside the code, there's nothing in the code that says that this is a real object that's generating a real experience. This object could not be experienced as an object unless there was someone essentially playing the game, right? If you take away the observer, if you take away the player, which is the mind, this object doesn't exist. None of this exists. The information has no server to be on. The mind, the dreamer, is the server. It is the mind that all of this is taking place in. Okay? So if we go back to the slide, let's read it one last time, then we'll end the video. All of this only begins to make sense when it's occurring within a greater medium or mind. So again, that greater server or dreamer or field that all the disturbances are interacting with. Within a mental field in which all of these disturbances are rising and falling and being perceived. Like a dreamer, a simulation, the brain isn't producing the mind, right? The object within the simulation isn't producing the simulation. It's the other way around. The mind is perceiving the brain, both as an object and a continuous experience. The only way that anything within the simulation or dream is experienced continuously as a continuous narrative or character is based on the subjective experience of the perceiver, right? Just like if you were to, break it down to ones and zeros, you would no longer see your character unless you know how to read code. So the character no longer exists, even though there's no real difference between the character and the code except for the scale, right? So it all has to do with the perceiver. If you can't perceive an object, then there is no object. For the same reason, a constellation of music aren't real unless they're being perceived by something that is capable of perceiving them in that way. So again, if we think about a constellation, Wow, that's a terrible star. If we think about a constellation, this isn't an object, right? But you can make it an object. And it only truly exists as an object when you create a relationship between these objects. And the relationship only exists on a common medium, right? So these stars can only ever be connected conceptually within a same medium. And the only medium that can contain all other mediums, contain all other containers, contain all other information is a mind, right? There's no way that if we take an object, that object makes any sense without context outside of it, right? Because again, if you zoom in or zoom out, every object is made of other objects. So the object can't exist unless there's something perceiving it to scale, like a separate object or something like that, that can verify or validate that this is all one object. Just like if you have two magnets, right? The field between them is what validates them as objects. Or when two hands touch, right? If two people are holding hands, then the only reason that their hands are touching is because the fields, the fields, their atoms are made up of these fields, and those fields, when they interact with each other, create that sort of Venn diagram. And it's the Venn diagram that allows the electrical signal to go through your nervous system and up to your brain and tell you that you're touching someone. But there's no real touching there. It's all just information. And the only time it becomes an experience is when that information is processed. But it can't be processed by a brain because the brain is an object that itself needs to be processed. So the only thing that can process other things without itself needing to be processed is a universal mind, a universal observer, a field that contains other fields. Okay? So hopefully that somewhat makes more sense of the kind of model that I was presenting in the Why Does Intelligence Manifest video, and hopefully this makes sense in a larger picture, right? Because that's really what we're trying to do, is we're trying to piece all these individual points together to help you understand my model and how it all kind of makes one big beautiful picture. And hopefully it helps you to understand yourself and the universe better. So that's it for this video. Thank you for your patience and listening, and I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you next time.